The U.S. government shutdown is often reported as a budgeting mishap, a quirk of partisan dysfunction. But look closer and it becomes clear this is not a glitch in the system, it is the system. By manufacturing crisis after crisis, political elites wield shutdowns as a weapon, forcing ordinary workers, families, and entire communities to shoulder the costs, while advancing an agenda that steadily undermines public trust in government itself. The government shutdown is so often portrayed as a kind of natural disaster, a storm that rolls in when Congress cannot agree on a budget and then passes once politicians finally hammer out a compromise. But this framing misses the deeper reality. Shutdowns are not accidental acts of nature. They are carefully cultivated crises wielded as weapons. They are political tools in an ongoing strategy of disruption where dysfunction itself becomes the method by which power is consolidated and reshaped. To understand this, we need to recognize that the shutdown is not a breakdown of governance, but rather a deliberate expression of it, an intentional leveraging of crisis to achieve ends that cannot be won through normal democratic debate. For decades, we have been told that government is inefficient, bloated, and incapable of managing itself. The shutdown takes that narrative and turns it into a self-fulfilling prophecy. By halting basic services and forcing federal agencies into paralysis, the political class manufactures proof of government's supposed incompetence. When a mother cannot get timely childcare assistance, when a farmer's subsidy payment is delayed, when a scientist at a federal lab is furloughed and their research disrupted, the lived experience of government as unreliable is etched deeper into the public consciousness. Those who advocate for smaller government, lower taxes, and privatization do not need to win an ideological argument. They simply need to create enough dysfunction that people lose faith in the very idea of public service. The shutdown, then, is less about saving money than about saving a story, the story of government as failure. But there is another layer to this strategy, one that echoes through the long history of what might be called shock politics. When institutions are deliberately destabilized, when order is interrupted, the population is placed into a state of uncertainty, and uncertainty breeds opportunity for those who know how to exploit it. A shutdown is not merely a pause in operations, it is a calculated use of interruption to push through changes that would otherwise encounter resistance. Programs go dark, oversight is weakened, and regulatory capacity dwindles. In this vacuum, corporate actors and lobbyists seize ground, pressing for looser rules, expanded contracts, and the outsourcing of services once considered untouchable. What looks like dysfunction from one angle is in fact a redistribution of power from the public to the private, from the collective to the corporate. It is telling that shutdowns rarely touch the most militarized aspects of the state. Defense contracts, surveillance programs, and policing functions are shielded under the banner of essential. What is sacrificed are the social safety nets, the educational supports, the scientific research, the very elements that bind a society together outside of raw coercion. In this way, shutdowns selectively strip away the fabric of civic life while leaving intact the apparatus of control. This is not incidental. It reflects a hierarchy of priorities that sees governance not as the provision of shared stability, but as the maintenance of order and the flow of capital. The shutdown becomes a kind of X-ray of the state, revealing where power truly resides and what is considered expendable. We are often told that such crises are the product of gridlock, of two political parties so entrenched in their ideological warfare that they cannot compromise. But to stop here is to miss the point. For one faction of the political establishment, the shutdown is not the unfortunate byproduct of stalemate. It is the goal. By proving that government cannot function, They justify their calls to dismantle it further. They win when people despair, when cynicism grows, when the very notion of public service is corroded. Dysfunction is not evidence of their failure, but rather the clearest sign of their success. Think of it like arson. A group of politicians sets fire to the house of government, then points to the flames as evidence that the structure was rotten all along. They argue that it should be demolished and replaced not with stronger public institutions, but with private alternatives, for-profit schools, privatized healthcare, outsourced prisons, deregulated markets. Every shutdown deepens the blaze, making it harder to imagine government as capable of offering security or stability. Over time, the public comes to accept chaos as normal, and in that normalization, the ground is prepared for more radical restructuring. The weaponization of crisis is not new. We have seen it in the aftermath of natural disasters, where rebuilding efforts are seized upon as opportunities for privatization and land grabs. We have seen it in financial meltdowns, where shock and fear are leveraged to justify bailouts for the powerful, while ordinary people lose homes and jobs. The government shutdown belongs to this same playbook. It is a form of self-inflicted disaster, one that destabilizes public life and opens the door for policies that would never survive in conditions of stability. It is shock politics by design. Crisis as ideology. The human cost, of course, is immense. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers are furloughed or forced to work without pay, their livelihoods transformed into bargaining chips. Contractors who will never see retroactive wages simply absorb the loss. Families who rely on federal assistance programs face uncertainty about their benefits. Communities dependent on federal services see their infrastructure strained. Yet these costs are not accidental collateral damage. They are part of the calculation. By placing ordinary people in precarious positions, shutdowns generate pressure from below, pressure that can be manipulated to force concessions from those desperate for relief. The cruelty is not incidental. It is instrumental. And while the headlines focus on the political spectacle in Washington, the broader effect is cultural. Each shutdown erodes trust in the very idea of collective governance. Each one teaches a new generation that their government is unreliable, fragile, incapable of continuity. Each one nudges the public toward private solutions, toward withdrawing into individual survival rather than collective struggle. Over time, this cynicism reshapes the political landscape itself, making it easier for demagogues to argue that only authoritarian force or unregulated markets can provide stability. In this sense, the shutdown is both a tactic and a pedagogy. It teaches us to expect less, to demand less, to accept less. To see the shutdown as simply a failure of bipartisanship is to fall for the surface narrative. Beneath that surface is a deliberate strategy honed over decades of using crisis as leverage. The government is not merely shutting down because it cannot agree on numbers in a spreadsheet. It is shutting down because for some, the breakdown is the point. The paralysis is the plan. The dysfunction is the evidence that their worldview is winning. In this way, the shutdown is not an accident to be lamented, but a weapon to be understood, resisted, and ultimately disarmed. When the government shuts down, the most immediate and visible casualties are the workers themselves. Overnight, hundreds of thousands of people are told not to show up at their jobs, or worse, to show up and work without pay. They become the frontline victims of a manufactured crisis, turned into hostages in a political standoff that they did not create and over which they have no control. This is not some minor inconvenience. It is the deliberate weaponization of livelihoods, a form of economic coercion that treats people's ability to pay rent, buy groceries, and support their families as bargaining chips in an ideological game. Federal workers are often painted as faceless bureaucrats, nameless cogs in a machine. But a closer look reveals how essential their work truly is. They are food inspectors ensuring that contaminated meat does not reach your plate. They are researchers tracking the spread of infectious diseases. They are clerks processing veterans' benefits and Social Security checks. They are firefighters on federal lands, air traffic controllers guiding planes safely across the sky, and childcare providers at military bases. When these people are forced into economic limbo, the consequences ripple far beyond their own households. It is not only their families that suffer, but the millions who depend on their labor for basic safety and stability. Yet, in the logic of shutdown politics, these people are rendered invisible, reduced to mere leverage. Consider the cruelty embedded in this system. Workers are classified as either essential or non-essential. The so-called non-essential employees are furloughed, meaning they are sent home without pay until the political impasse is resolved. Essential employees, meanwhile, must continue working, but their paychecks are frozen. The language itself is demeaning, as though the contributions of the furloughed are somehow expendable, as though their absence does not carry real costs for the functioning of society. In reality, many of the so-called non-essential functions, scientific research, environmental monitoring, education programs, are precisely the kinds of long-term investments a healthy society cannot do without. By labeling them disposable, the shutdown narrative diminishes their value and prepares the ground for permanent cuts. The hostage-taking metaphor is not hyperbole. In a hostage situation, innocent people are held against their will, their safety threatened in order to extract concessions. That is exactly what happens in a shutdown. The lives of workers are placed on hold, their pay withheld, their stability shattered in order to pressure political opponents into surrendering. And like hostages, they are deliberately placed in harm's way to maximize leverage. The pain is not incidental, but instrumental. It is the very point of the exercise. The suffering of workers is designed to create public outrage, to generate pressure, to shift the dynamics of negotiation. And unlike traditional hostages, these workers have no recourse. They cannot simply quit and walk away without losing careers they have built for decades. Many live in communities where the federal government is the largest employer, where leaving would mean uprooting families and abandoning stability altogether. They are trapped in a system that depends on their loyalty while offering little protection from political exploitation. For contractors, janitors, cafeteria staff, and other low-wage workers who keep federal buildings running, the situation is even harsher. Unlike salaried federal employees, many of them will never see retroactive pay when the shutdown ends. Their lost wages are lost forever, their bills still due, their hardships invisible to the broader public. The impact stretches beyond paychecks. Furloughed workers lose access to workplace routines, health care coverage may lapse, retirement contributions stall. Essential workers who must labor without pay experience mounting stress, forced to balance the demands of high-stakes jobs with the anxiety of unpaid bills. Imagine guiding hundreds of passengers safely through crowded skies while wondering how you will cover next month's rent. Imagine fighting wildfires on federal land while your bank account dwindles to nothing. This is not simply a financial inconvenience. It is a profound assault on dignity, security, and mental health. The hostage-taking extends to communities as well. In cities and towns heavily dependent on federal jobs, the shutdown ripples through local economies. Restaurants lose customers, childcare providers lose clients, landlords face tenants who suddenly cannot pay. Small businesses that rely on government contracts see projects suspended. The pain radiates outward, capturing not just federal workers, but entire communities in its grasp. In this sense, the shutdown is not merely a political standoff in Washington, but a nationwide act of economic violence. What is perhaps most striking is how normalized this cruelty has become. Each time the government shuts down, media coverage often frames it as a partisan stalemate, a clash of political egos. The workers, meanwhile, are relegated to side notes, their suffering mentioned but rarely centered. Yet they are the ones who make government function on a daily basis, the ones whose labor sustains the very fabric of public life. By rendering them collateral damage, the political class reveals its true priorities: ideology over humanity, spectacle over service. There is also an insidious pedagogy at work here. Each shutdown teaches workers that their livelihoods are precarious, that their financial stability can be snatched away at the whim of political elites. This insecurity is not just a byproduct. It is a lesson designed to weaken collective power. Precarious workers are less likely to resist, less likely to organize, more likely to accept concessions. The shutdown thus serves as a form of discipline, reminding federal employees that their security is contingent, fragile, and ultimately disposable. The broader public, too, is taught to view these workers with suspicion or indifference. The framing of them as pawns in a political game obscures their real humanity and contribution. The narrative of government waste or bureaucratic inefficiency primes citizens to see their suffering as unfortunate, but necessary, even justified. This ideological work ensures that the outrage generated by shutdowns rarely translates into structural change. Instead, workers are sent back to their posts once the standoff ends, retroactive paychecks in hand, as though the trauma of economic uncertainty can be erased with a single deposit. Yet the scars remain. Trust is eroded. Morale declines. Talented workers leave government service for more stable private sector jobs, draining public institutions of expertise and commitment. The very act of holding workers hostage undermines the long-term capacity of government itself. And perhaps that is the ultimate goal. By making government employment unstable and unattractive, shutdowns accelerate the hollowing out of the public sector, leaving the private sphere to fill the void. Seen this way, the workers are not simply caught in the crossfire, they are the target. Their suffering is not an unintended side effect, but a deliberate tool, a means of reshaping the relationship between citizens and the state. Each paycheck withheld, each day of uncertainty, each bill unpaid serves to reinforce the message that government cannot be trusted, that public service is a risky endeavor, that collective structures of support are brittle and unreliable. It is a cruel calculus, one that prioritizes ideological purity over human well-being, one that treats people as expendable in the pursuit of power. When we strip away the political theater, the shutdown is revealed for what it truly is, a hostage situation in which the captors are elected officials and the hostages are ordinary workers and their families. Their suffering is leveraged, their dignity assaulted, their futures toyed with, all in the name of a political game that rewards cruelty and normalizes dysfunction. To call it governance is an insult. It is coercion masquerading as negotiation, exploitation disguised as fiscal prudence. Until we name this dynamic for what it is, until we refuse to accept the human toll as collateral damage, the cycle will repeat again and again. Workers held hostage in a system that thrives on their pain. Every government shutdown makes clear what is considered expendable and what is deemed essential. The lines are drawn not by what sustains life and community, but by what sustains the market and the machinery of security. In these moments, public services, the programs and institutions that knit society together, that provide education, research, health protections, and community resources are thrown onto life support. They are starved of funds, starved of continuity, starved of the ability to plan and act in the long term. What emerges is a lesson written into daily experience. Government cannot be relied upon. Public services are fragile, and perhaps they should be replaced with private alternatives. The shutdown is not just a pause in governance. It is an ongoing act of ideological sabotage. Think of the institutions shuttered or gutted during each shutdown. National parks close their gates, museums lock their doors, cultural programs fall silent. Scientific research projects, often years in the making, are abruptly halted, sometimes in ways that render the data useless. Inspectors who keep our food safe are sent home, creating gaps in oversight that could have long-term consequences for public health. Environmental monitoring is paused at a time when climate change demands constant vigilance. These services are not luxuries, they are the infrastructure of a functioning society. When they are cut off, the message is not simply that they are temporarily unavailable. The deeper message is that they are dispensable, that public life is something we can do without. The framing of essential versus non-essential during shutdowns does enormous ideological work. When the public hears that certain services are non-essential, they may internalize the idea that these services are frivolous. But what does it mean to call the monitoring of disease outbreaks non-essential? What does it mean to classify educational grants or housing programs as optional? The very language reprograms our collective understanding of value, downgrading the importance of anything that is not immediately tied to policing, the military, or the flow of capital. Over time, this rhetorical trick becomes self-fulfilling. If services are constantly labeled non-essential, they begin to appear non-essential, making it easier for politicians to permanently defund them. And yet, the public feels their absence acutely. Families who rely on government nutrition programs face uncertainty. Students lose access to grants. Travelers encounter chaos as the aviation system strains under the weight of unpaid staff. Farmers waiting on loans or subsidies are left in limbo, their planting and harvesting cycles disrupted. The pain of these interruptions is real, but it is also uneven. For the wealthy, who can afford private alternatives, the shutdown is an inconvenience. For the poor, working class, and marginalized communities, it is a direct assault on stability. In this way, the shutdown deepens inequality, stripping services away from those who need them most while leaving untouched the networks of privilege that cushion the elite. This weaponization of public services is not just about withholding them temporarily. It is about delegitimizing them altogether. Each shutdown erodes public confidence in the ability of government institutions to function reliably. When museums and parks close, when grants and programs stall, the public absorbs the lesson that the state cannot be trusted to deliver. That skepticism becomes fertile ground for privatization. If the government cannot keep national parks open, perhaps private corporations should run them. If federal research is constantly interrupted, perhaps private labs should take over. If housing programs collapse under shutdown strain, perhaps the market should be left to decide who deserves a home. In this way, the crisis of shutdowns is not simply destructive, it is generative. It creates new openings for the market to colonize spaces once considered public. The consequences are long-term. A research project interrupted for weeks may lose its funding entirely. A delayed environmental report may miss key data on pollution or species decline. An understaffed regulatory agency may fall behind in its inspections, creating loopholes that industry is quick to exploit. Shutdowns do not simply pause these functions, they degrade them, making it harder for them to recover even after funding is restored. The result is a slow motion hollowing out of the public sector, where capacity is steadily diminished until it becomes easier to argue that government is simply incapable of doing the job. Meanwhile, the sectors deemed essential reveal a telling hierarchy. Military operations continue, border patrol functions remain, surveillance systems hum along, policing persists. The apparatus of coercion and control is never paused, even as the apparatus of care and culture is starved. This disparity exposes the priorities baked into the state itself. It is not that government cannot function during a shutdown. It is that it chooses to continue only those functions tied to force and profit. Everything else is put on hold, reinforcing the notion that the social state is optional while the security state is indispensable. The media plays its role in reinforcing this logic. Coverage of shutdowns often zeroes in on the political drama, on the winners and losers in Congress, while treating the closure of public services as background noise. Photos of locked gates at the national parks may surface briefly, but the structural assault on the public realm rarely makes the front page. This erasure contributes to the invisibility of the shutdown's real damage. The public sees disruption, but not the deliberate ideological project behind it. They are left to believe this is simply the cost of partisan gridlock, rather than the outcome of a strategy aimed at eroding the very foundations of public life. For those who depend on public services, however, the damage is impossible to ignore. A single parent denied timely assistance, a cancer patient whose clinical trial is suspended, a low-income student cut off from scholarship funds. These are not abstract inconveniences, but existential threats. And while shutdowns eventually end, the insecurity they generate lingers. People learn that services can disappear overnight, that the safety nets they rely on can unravel at the whim of political theater. This lesson corrodes trust in government itself, pushing people toward resignation or the false security of private alternatives. The irony is that many of these same public services are wildly popular. Americans of all political persuasions treasure national parks, rely on food and drug safety, value disaster relief, depend on reliable air travel, and benefit from scientific research. Yet the shutdown weaponizes their popularity, turning them into pawns in a negotiation. Politicians leverage the public's frustration to score points, all while ensuring that the damage to the services themselves accumulates over time. In the end, the people who most value and rely on public services are the ones most betrayed by their fragility. The result is a cycle that feeds on itself. Shutdowns degrade public services, which in turn fuels narratives of inefficiency and incompetence. Those narratives are used to justify further defunding, which makes the services even more fragile, making them easier to cut again in the next crisis. It is a death spiral for the public sphere, one engineered not by accident but by design. The point is not to save money. It is to save a worldview that insists collective life is unworkable, that only the private market can deliver stability. When we witness government services on life support during a shutdown, we are not simply observing a temporary pause. We are witnessing a strategy of attrition, a war of erosion against the very idea of the commons. Each furlough, each closed gate, each missed payment is a reminder that the state we rely on is vulnerable by design, that it can be turned off like a switch when it no longer serves the priorities of those in power. And until we confront the ideological roots of this strategy, until we insist that public services are not negotiable bargaining chips, but the backbone of democracy itself, they will continue to be starved, suspended, and sacrificed in the name of political theater. The shutdown is often treated as a temporary interruption, an unfortunate side effect of partisan warfare, but in reality it functions as a textbook demonstration of what has been called the shock doctrine, the deliberate use of crisis to push through changes that would otherwise be impossible. When the machinery of government is stalled, when agencies are shuttered and workers are furloughed, society is pushed into a state of suspended animation. Uncertainty becomes the air everyone breathes. It is in this atmosphere of confusion and vulnerability that the most aggressive forms of restructuring occur, not through open debate or consensus, but through the opportunism of those who see chaos not as a failure, but as an opening. The shock doctrine relies on disorientation. In the aftermath of natural disasters, wars, or financial collapses, citizens are overwhelmed, their sense of normalcy disrupted. They are too busy coping with immediate survival to resist structural changes imposed in the background. Shutdowns operate on the same principle. While the public frets about closed parks or missed paychecks, deeper transformations take place behind the curtain. Contracts are quietly reassigned, regulatory oversight is weakened, and lobbyists seize the chance to advance deregulatory agendas that would be more difficult to justify under stable conditions. The paralysis of public institutions creates a vacuum, and in that vacuum, private power surges forward. Consider how corporations benefit during these shutdowns. When food inspectors are furloughed, industries gain reprieve from oversight. When environmental monitoring is paused, polluting industries face less scrutiny. When federal research is interrupted, private labs and universities step into the gap, securing funding streams that might otherwise flow through public channels. A shutdown may appear on the surface as a moment of government weakness, but for corporations, it is an opportunity to tighten their grip. They can offer to provide the services that government has failed to deliver, often at a profit and with far less accountability. What begins as an emergency workaround hardens into permanent privatization. This is not hypothetical. It is a well-worn path. After Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, public schools were gutted and replaced with a system dominated by charter schools. After the 2008 financial crisis, austerity measures hollowed out public services while banks and private equity firms consolidated their power. Each disaster created conditions where radical restructuring could be presented as pragmatic necessity. The shutdown functions in the same way, by normalizing the suspension of government, by training the public to accept that services can disappear overnight. It lays the groundwork for arguments that those services should never have been public to begin with. If public housing programs can be shut down, why not hand them to private developers? If federal science can be stalled, why not leave it to corporate R&D? The crisis becomes the justification, the shock the lever. The shock doctrine also thrives on speed. Shutdowns move quickly, pulling the rug out from under workers and communities in a matter of days. The suddenness creates confusion and fear, which are essential for the politics of shock. People scramble to make ends meet, to cover their bills, to find childcare, to cope with uncertainty. In this chaos, long-term questions of democracy and public goods are pushed aside. The urgent eclipses the important. And while attention is fixed on the daily spectacle of partisan blame games, decisions are made in the shadows that permanently reshape the relationship between state, market, and citizen. The cruel genius of this process is that it is self-reinforcing. Each shutdown creates new openings for privatization, and each wave of privatization makes public institutions weaker and more vulnerable to future shutdowns. When public functions are outsourced, the government loses capacity. The next time a shutdown occurs, there is less resilience, fewer resources to absorb the shock. This fragility is then cited as evidence that government cannot be trusted, which justifies yet more outsourcing. It is a cycle of erosion designed to end in the hollowing out of the state itself, leaving only the skeletal functions of defense, policing, and border control intact. For ordinary people, living under the shock doctrine of shutdowns means living with constant insecurity. Benefits may be suspended, paychecks may vanish, programs may evaporate without warning. This insecurity is not a side effect, but a feature. It disciplines workers and communities into submission, teaching them to lower expectations, to view public services as unreliable, to seek stability in private alternatives. Over time, the very idea of government as a provider of stability is undermined. Citizens are recast as consumers, encouraged to purchase privately what was once guaranteed publicly. The shift is not only economic, but cultural, reshaping how people imagine their relationship to the collective. The rhetoric of fiscal responsibility cloaks this process in a veneer of legitimacy. Shutdowns are justified as battles over spending, as principled stands against debt or waste. But beneath the rhetoric lies a deeper truth. These crises are engineered to advance a long-standing ideological project. The goal is not to balance budgets, but to delegitimize the very notion of public provision. The shutdown is an accelerant, a manufactured emergency that makes radical dismantling appear as pragmatic necessity. And because it is presented as the result of political deadlock, responsibility is diffused, making it harder to hold anyone accountable for the structural damage inflicted. At the same time, the shutdown produces profound political fatigue. Each round of crisis drains energy from workers, activists, and ordinary citizens. People become exhausted by the cycles of disruption, cynical about the possibility of change, resigned to instability as the new normal. This resignation is itself part of the shock doctrine. The less people believe in the possibility of a functioning government, the easier it becomes to push through measures that further weaken it. A demoralized public is easier to manipulate than a hopeful one. The shutdown thus operates both as an economic weapon and as a psychological one, targeting not only paychecks but imaginations. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, anger simmers. Workers forced to labor without pay, communities deprived of vital services, families thrown into uncertainty. They all feel the cruelty of the shutdown in their bones. The challenge is whether that anger is directed upward at the architects of the crisis or downward at the very idea of government. The shock doctrine thrives when frustration is misdirected, when people blame big government rather than the deliberate sabotage of those who benefit from its collapse. Breaking this cycle requires naming the strategy for what it is, not a failure of governance, but a calculated use of crisis as cover for a transfer of power and wealth. In this light, the shutdown is not just a pause in normal operations. It is a form of governance in its own right, a politics of shock designed to destabilize the public sphere and expand the reach of private power. Each closed office, each unpaid worker, each delayed service is part of a larger script, one that has been rehearsed in disaster zones, financial crises, and wars. The playbook is the same. Use crisis to force open doors that would otherwise remain shut, then rush through with policies that entrench inequality and hollow out democracy. The tragedy is that this playbook has been so effective and that each shutdown not only repeats the script, but deepens its hold, teaching us to expect less from our institutions and to accept more from those who profit in the shadows of our disorientation. A government shutdown is not only an economic disruption or a bureaucratic inconvenience, it is a slow, corrosive attack on the architecture of democracy itself. When the machinery of governance grinds to a halt, when public services are suspended and workers are sent home, the immediate harm is visible. But beneath the surface, something far more insidious takes root. the erosion of the collective belief that government can function, that institutions can serve, that democracy is capable of delivering stability. Each shutdown leaves scars not just on the economy, but on the public psyche, eating away at the fragile infrastructure of trust that democracy depends upon. Democracy is more than elections or political theater. It is a lived system of trust in which people expect certain basic guarantees. They expect that their work will be paid, that their benefits will arrive, that their safety will be monitored, that their children's food will be inspected, that disasters will be responded to, that the rules are not arbitrary. Shutdowns undermine this baseline. Suddenly, the guarantees become conditional. Paychecks vanish, benefits are delayed, safety nets are torn. The message is unmistakable. The government that is supposed to serve you can abandon you at any moment. That abandonment is corrosive because democracy depends on legitimacy, and legitimacy is built on reliability. Without reliability, democracy ceases to feel like a system of governance and starts to look like a game of chance. This corrosion does not happen in a vacuum. It feeds directly into broader cycles of disillusionment and disengagement. When people watch their government repeatedly falter, when they see public officials unable or unwilling to fulfill the most basic functions, they begin to lose faith in the value of participation. Why bother voting? Why bother organizing? Why bother believing in reform if the outcome is endless stalemate and breakdown? This is not apathy in the lazy sense. It is exhaustion weaponized. Citizens become spectators, convinced that the system is broken beyond repair. And into this void of trust, new forms of authority step forward, often authoritarian in nature, offering the false promise of efficiency and strength in place of messy democratic process. Shutdowns also weaken the connective tissue between citizens and the state. Every time a service disappears, every time a benefit is delayed, the bond between people and institutions frays a little more. These bonds are what make democracy tangible in everyday life. It is not only about ballots cast every few years. It is about the daily interactions with public schools, post offices, healthcare providers, disaster relief, and social safety nets. When those interactions become unreliable, when government becomes a source of anxiety instead of stability, democracy recedes from experience. People stop seeing it as something that belongs to them and start regarding it as something external, alien, and incompetent. The erosion is intensified by the way shutdowns are framed in public discourse. They are often portrayed as partisan spectacles, as evidence of both sides failing to compromise. This framing blurs responsibility, allowing those who engineer shutdowns as strategy to escape accountability. The deeper effect is that politics itself begins to look like a perpetual farce, a circus where no one is serious and nothing gets done. Cynicism replaces engagement, and the very idea of collective governance is discredited. If politics is only a stage for dysfunction, then the audience will eventually stop showing up. Democracy becomes hollow, not through a coup or a dramatic collapse, but through steady neglect and disbelief. Meanwhile, the people most directly harmed by shutdowns are rarely the ones with the power to resolve them. Federal employees working without pay, contractors who never see back pay, families whose benefits are disrupted, communities reliant on public programs, they are placed in an impossible position. They are told to endure, to sacrifice, to wait while decisions are held hostage by partisan brinkmanship. Their suffering is both the collateral damage and the bargaining chip. The repeated experience of being treated as expendable erodes their faith that government represents them. It teaches them that they are pawns in a larger game, and pawns rarely trust the players. This distrust becomes fertile ground for anti-democratic narratives. Every shutdown is seized upon by those who argue that government is inherently incompetent, that public services are inherently unreliable, that only private markets or strongmen can provide stability. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy, manufacture dysfunction, then point to dysfunction as evidence of failure. Over time, the chorus grows louder, persuading more people that democracy itself is incapable of meeting modern challenges. This is the deeper danger of shutdowns, not just the temporary suspension of services, but the permanent suspension of belief. The erosion of democracy's infrastructure is not dramatic. It does not happen in a single moment of collapse. It happens incrementally through each paycheck delayed, each program stalled, each public service shuttered. The damage accumulates in the background, invisible, until suddenly it feels irreversible. Trust is difficult to rebuild once it is lost, because trust is not restored by rhetoric alone. It requires consistency, reliability, proof in action. Each shutdown makes that rebuilding harder, adding another layer of skepticism to the already fragile faith in institutions. Shutdowns also expose the unequal distribution of democratic vulnerability. The wealthy and powerful can insulate themselves from disruptions. They can rely on private services, private schools, private healthcare, private security. For them, a shutdown is an inconvenience, not a crisis. But for working people, for the poor, for marginalized communities who depend most on public services, the shutdown is devastating. This unequal exposure deepens the perception that democracy does not serve everyone equally, that it is rigged to protect the privileged while sacrificing the vulnerable. And when democracy is seen as unequal in its protections, its legitimacy is further eroded. At the international level, shutdowns tarnish the image of democracy abroad. The United States presents itself as a model of governance, yet it repeatedly demonstrates paralysis so severe that basic functions cannot be maintained. This contradiction weakens the moral authority of democratic advocacy worldwide. Other regimes seize on shutdowns as proof that democracy is chaotic and dysfunctional, pointing to them as cautionary tales. The erosion of trust is not only domestic, it reverberates across borders, diminishing the credibility of democracy as a system worth aspiring to. The long-term consequence is a public sphere weakened to the point where authoritarian solutions appear attractive. When people are repeatedly let down by democratic institutions, when they see endless cycles of dysfunction, they may begin to welcome those who promise to bypass the messiness of democracy altogether. Give me stability, give me certainty, give me someone who can get things done, becomes the cry. It is the cry that has fueled strongmen across the world, from Latin America to Eastern Europe to Asia. Shutdowns, by eroding the infrastructure of trust, pave the way for these figures to rise, presenting themselves as antidotes to the very chaos that democratic breakdown produces. In the end, a shutdown is never just about budgets. It is about the story it tells the public that democracy cannot guarantee stability, that government cannot be relied upon, that the collective will is fragile and disposable. Each shutdown etches this story deeper into the public imagination, weakening the foundations on which democracy rests. The risk is not only short-term harm, but long-term decay, a hollowing out of belief that leaves space for authoritarianism to flourish. If democracy is to survive these cycles of sabotage, it will require more than reopening offices and restoring paychecks. It will require rebuilding the infrastructure of trust, proving through consistent action that government can deliver, that democracy can function, that the collective can be stronger than the forces trying to break it.